It was around 2 a.m. when I got the ping. I'd been driving for about 12 hours already, trying to make up for the shift I missed a few days ago when I was sick. My car was starting to feel like an extension of myself. The smell of stale coffee, the crinkling of fast food wrappers on the passenger seat, and the soft hum of the engine had all become comforting in a weird, sad way. I was just about to call it a night, too. My phone buzzed, and I saw the Uber request pop up. Pickup. 1327 Vine Street. It was only a few miles away, not too far from my usual route. The name on the request was Cameron, which didn't ring any bells. But then again, I'd picked up hundreds of people over the months. I hesitated for a second, wondering if it was really worth it to go on one more trip. But the little red notification on my app kept blinking, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I'd hit my target for the night. I swiped the screen. Accept ride. Driving through the empty streets of the city at night is always strange. The usual bustle of honking cars, chatter, and sirens dies down. The streets feel foreign, even though they're part of your routine. The night transforms everything, softens the edges, and makes it hard to tell what's real. That's how I felt as I pulled up to the address. It was a modest building, one of those older apartment complexes with peeling paint and an atmosphere that screamed neglect without actually saying it. There were a couple of other cars parked outside, but it seemed quiet. I figured the guy was probably coming out of one of the units to the side. I checked the app again. The location was spot on. I pressed the horn once. Nothing. Pressed it again. Still nothing. A part of me thought it was just another false alarm. Someone who'd requested a ride and then forgot about it. But I could hear someone shuffling inside the building. A few seconds later, a man stepped out from the shadow of the doorway, glancing around for a moment before his eyes landed on my car. He started walking toward me, not in a hurry, but not slowly, either just a straight line toward the passenger side door. I watched him approach. He looked off. Maybe it was the way he moved, like he was walking just a bit too stiffly. Maybe it was the clothes jeans that were a little too long and a hoodie that hung loosely around his frame. His face was what stuck with me. He wasn't wearing any expression, like his face was a mask he was too tired to take off. His eyes were locked on the car, but there was something empty about them. I waved my hand through the window, just to make sure I was looking at the right person. Cameron? He nodded, opening the door slowly and getting in the back seat without saying a word. As soon as the door clicked shut, I felt a chill, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. But I brushed it off. You don't think about stuff like that when you're doing your job. Where to? I asked, already pulling away from the curb. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back against the seat and stared straight ahead, the faint light from the street lamps barely illuminating his face. It was an awkward silence at first, but I didn't push him. Some people like to sit in silence after a long day. After a minute or two, I glanced in the rearview mirror. His eyes were still fixed on the back of my seat, like he was staring into space. That uneasy feeling crept up on me again. You okay? I asked, my voice a little louder than necessary. Yeah, he replied, but it sounded too automatic. Just drive. I nodded and focused on the road, trying to shake off the weird vibe. It wasn't uncommon for people to be a little distant after a long day or after a few drinks. He was probably exhausted, and I'd just assumed too much. We drove in silence for another few minutes. The city looked quieter than usual. The streets emptied out, the bars closed. It was just me, him, and the hum of the car. Then the weirdness started to show up. First, it was the tapping. It was so faint I wasn't sure if I was hearing things. But when I glanced up again, Cameron was drumming his fingers on the window, barely perceptible, a soft rhythm that didn't quite match the mood. My pulse quickened, but I didn't say anything. I was used to quiet rides. People did strange things when they were in their own heads. Another minute passed. He still wasn't saying anything, and I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. It was like I could feel his presence in the car now, like his body heat was closing in around me. The air was thick, heavy, and that tap, tap, tap on the window didn't stop. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't ignore it. His fingers kept drumming faster now, like he was impatient, and still no words. I cleared my throat. Hey man, can I turn on the radio or something? It's a long drive. He didn't respond, but the tapping stopped. I glanced up in the rearview mirror again. Cameron's eyes were no longer looking ahead. He was staring at me, really staring through the reflection of the mirror. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, unnervingly intense. And still, he didn't say a word. I felt my chest tighten. I turned the volume on the radio just to fill the void. I could hear the static before the music began, the faint buzz that felt like it was coming from all around us, not just the speakers. Then Cameron spoke, but it wasn't what I was expecting. "Do you ever wonder," his voice was barely above a whisper, "how many people you really see in a day?" I didn't respond right away. "What do you say to that?" He kept going, his voice lower now. "You think you see everyone. You think you know them, but you don't, not really." I glanced at him in the mirror. "What are you talking about?" "You don't get it," he said, his voice taking on an eerie tone. "You don't see people. You just pass them. It's all the same. They're all the same." My heart raced as I focused on the road, trying not to show how uncomfortable I was. This wasn't normal small talk. It felt more like a conversation I was supposed to be part of, but I didn't know how to respond. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, hoping to get to the destination quicker. But before I could say anything else, I noticed something in my peripheral vision, a shadow, a figure, standing by the side of the road. I jerked my head to the side to get a better look, but there was nothing there. The road was empty, just empty, fog-filled streets. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, trying to laugh it off. But then I noticed something else. The tapping. It was back, but this time, it was louder, more frantic. Tap, 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 tap. I glanced in the rearview mirror again. Cameron wasn't sitting there anymore. My stomach dropped. He was gone. I slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the street. I threw my eyes around, panicking, but there was no sign of him. I couldn't breathe. I turned to check the back seat, and there he was right behind me. His face was inches from mine, and his eyes, they weren't empty anymore. They were filled with something else, something I couldn't describe. His lips parted, and his voice was barely audible. "Now you see me," he whispered. The last thing I remember was the sound of the car door opening, the rush of cold air filling the space, and the sensation of something pulling me from the seat, dragging me into the night. I haven't driven since. I've been an Uber driver for almost 2 years. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. I got to meet all sorts of people, which made the job interesting enough. Some were friendly, others were quiet, and a few were downright strange. But I never thought much of it. After all, people are unpredictable, right? That night, though, it changed everything. I've replayed the events over and over, trying to make sense of them. But the truth is, I can't. It all started when I picked up my last fare for the night. It was a little after midnight, and I was on my way home. I had just dropped off a couple at their apartment and was headed to a nearby gas station when the app pinged. The name popped up on my screen. Kara. The address was in a part of town I wasn't all that familiar with, though it wasn't far from the main roads. Normally, I wouldn't take a ride at this hour, but I figured it'd be a short one, and then I could call it a night. I pressed the accept button, and the directions guided me toward an old, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. As I drove down the street, I noticed the houses were older, worn down even. The kind of neighborhood you'd see in a horror movie, the kind that didn't feel like it belonged in this city. I pulled up to the address. A small, dilapidated house with no lights on, except for the dim glow of the street lamp overhead. It looked empty, like the kind of house that hadn't been lived in for years. I turned the car off and sat there for a second. The door didn't open, and I was starting to wonder if I had the wrong place. I checked my phone again, confirmed the address, and looked up. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere. 1 second, the porch was empty, and then she was standing there right in front of my car. Kara. She was tall, slender, dressed in all black, with long, dark hair that hung in front of her face. Her posture was stiff, almost too stiff, like she was afraid to move too much. She wasn't looking at me, though. Her gaze was fixed on the ground. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined it. Maybe I just missed her walking up. But something about her seemed off. I don't know what it was. It was the way she stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I honked the horn, and she immediately jerked her head up, her eyes locking onto mine. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other. The silence stretched on. "Are you Kara?" I asked, not sure why I even had to ask. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Sorry I'm late." "No worries," I said, still feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to seem rude. She opened the back door without a word, slid into the seat, and buckled her seatbelt. I didn't see her face at first. She just kept her head down, her hair covering her features. I glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see her eyes in the reflection, but her face was still hidden. I shook my head, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping over me. "Where are we headed?" I asked, hoping the simple question would break the tension. She didn't answer right away, and I had to glance at her through the rearview again. Kara was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Can you just drive for a bit?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. That was odd. Most passengers had a destination in mind. I'd even had people tell me to just drive around for a few minutes if they were feeling anxious or upset. But this was different. The request itself wasn't unusual, but the way she said it, it was like she didn't really care where we were going. "Sure," I said, trying to be accommodating. I started driving, keeping my eyes on the road. The streets were dark, the occasional light flickering overhead. There was a heavy fog settling over the city, making everything feel distant, as if the whole world was shutting down, one layer at a time. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Kara hadn't moved an inch. Her head was still lowered, her long hair hanging like a curtain around her face. I tried to make small talk. "Long night?" She didn't answer. "Do you have any music preferences?" I offered, reaching to turn on the radio. Nothing. She just sat there, silent. I kept driving, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. I could hear my own breathing, the hum of the car's engine, the occasional click of the turn signal as I made my way through unfamiliar streets. Then, a sound broke the silence, a sound I wasn't prepared for. It was a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was the car's window fogging up or maybe something loose in the back seat, but then it came again. Tap, 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 tap. I turned my head slightly, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror once more. Kara hadn't moved, but there was something in her hands. She was holding a small silver pocket knife. The blade was gently tapping against the seatbelt, as though she were fiddling with it absent-mindedly. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the wheel. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the sudden tension in my voice. "Hey, y'all, what are you doing with that?" She didn't respond. I didn't know what to make of it. It was so subtle, so strange, but it was enough to send my pulse skyrocketing. What was she doing? Why was she so quiet? Was she okay? And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The tapping ceased. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating. I tried to focus on the road, to push the feeling of dread that was growing inside me to the back of my mind. "Where are we going exactly?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly now. Still nothing. I glanced at the mirror again. Kara's head was tilted back now, her eyes half-lidded, staring up at the ceiling of the car. Her expression was vacant, empty. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts were screaming at me to pull over, to stop the car, but I couldn't. I had to keep going. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe she was tired, or maybe she was going through something difficult. I drove for another few minutes, the fog growing thicker around me, and then I saw it. The road ahead was blocked. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the pavement. There was no way through. I slammed on the brakes, jerking the car to a stop. The engine hummed to a halt. And that's when I heard it, the sound of the knife scraping against the metal of the door. I turned. Kara wasn't in the back seat anymore. I didn't know how she had moved so silently, but now she was standing behind me, her face inches from mine. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wide open, locked onto mine with a blank stare that felt like it was peeling me apart. "Go," she whispered. "Drive." My heart was hammering in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I could barely think. I slammed the car in reverse, spinning the wheel and speeding away. The road was twisting, the fog swallowing me whole. The further I went, the more it felt like the world was closing in, like there was no escape. The city was gone. There was only her. And when I looked into the rearview mirror again, she was still there, watching me. I remember the night it all started. The air was cooler than usual for early autumn, a crispness hanging in the atmosphere as the streetlights flickered in the haze of early morning fog. I had just dropped off my last ride. A couple of young kids heading home from a night out, laughing as they disappeared into their apartment building. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I needed the money. One more ride, just one more. It wasn't supposed to be anything unusual. I'd driven thousands of people, from all walks of life, drunk college students, tired office workers, tourists, and businessmen. It's all just a blur after a while. The same routine, the same questions. How's your night going? Are you busy? How much do you make? But the last ride, it was different. I accepted the trip request, barely glancing at the phone before pulling into traffic. Pickup, 317 Ravenwood Street. The name on the ride was Theo. I didn't think much of it. I'd had plenty of customers with unusual names. The address was a bit out of my usual range, but it wasn't too far to drive, and I was already out there, so why not? The street I was heading to looked empty. The houses were spaced out, older buildings with the kind of quiet that felt unsettling at times, like the kind of neighborhood where you only heard the occasional car pass by. I parked near the curb, the soft hum of my engine idling as I glanced at the phone for the confirmation. When I saw him, I felt the first flicker of unease. He was standing near the end of the block, under the street lamp, facing away from me. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, almost blending into the shadows. I pulled my phone down from the dashboard and double-checked the name. Theo, it read. I hadn't seen him move, and yet he was getting closer to the car. I pushed the door open slightly, half expecting him to wave or speak, but he didn't. Just a soft shuffle of footsteps. He climbed into the back seat without a word. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His face was pale, with a faint sheen of sweat along his forehead, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the hour. I didn't even see him take them off once we started driving. Where to? I asked, trying to sound casual, masking the hint of discomfort creeping up on me. Straight ahead, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I'll let you know when to turn. I nodded, settling into the drive. At first, it seemed like a regular ride. He didn't make small talk, and I didn't push him. Sometimes, people just want to get from point A to point B, but the silence felt different. It wasn't comfortable, like when someone just doesn't feel like talking. It was oppressive, like there was something more pressing under the surface. A feeling I couldn't place, but it was there, gnawing at me. As I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't that he was staring at me, it was more that his presence was suffocating. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but his face was just a shadow, his features obscured by the angle. We passed an intersection, and something strange happened. My phone buzzed on the dashboard, but it wasn't the usual notification from Uber. It was a text message, a single word, turn. I frowned, glancing back at Theo, who was still perfectly still, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead of us. Turn where? I asked, though I immediately regretted it. What if it wasn't him who sent it? Maybe someone else had hacked my phone, or it was some random glitch. But Theo didn't say a word, just gently nodded his head, as if he was answering a question I didn't ask. I slowed the car, turning at the next right, but the unease lingered. My phone buzzed again, another message, left. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but I followed the instructions, making a left onto another dark street. The houses here were even more spaced out, isolated. I didn't like the feeling of being so far from the main road. There were no other cars, no lights, just the dark stretch of road ahead. Theo's response was immediate, but his voice sounded almost distant. Keep driving. I kept going, though my eyes darted between the road and the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was like he was pulling the strings, controlling everything. Each turn, each direction, it all felt planned, like he knew exactly where we were going. But I didn't, and it was starting to scare me. Another message. Stop. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the street. My heart was pounding now, the adrenaline starting to take hold. I tried to look at Theo again, but he was still sitting in the back seat, motionless, his hands folded in his lap, his head slightly tilted to one side. I didn't know what to do. My gut was telling me to drive away, to speed off and forget this ever happened. But something else, something deeper kept me there, rooted to the spot. Then, just as quickly as the tension had built, the silence was broken again. I need you to listen carefully, Theo said, his voice now sharp, a slight tremor in it. Do you hear that? I froze. There was nothing. Just the sound of the car's engine idling, the faint hum of the streetlights. No birds, no wind, no voices, nothing. "No," I whispered, my heart racing. "I don't hear anything." Theo's voice dropped lower, so low I had to strain to hear. "Exactly." I wanted to turn around. I wanted to get out of the car, to scream, to do anything. But my body wouldn't obey. It was like I was caught in some kind of trance. Suddenly, the car lurched forward as if it had been pushed from behind. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the car continued moving as if something was pulling us forward. The steering wheel twisted under my hands, making it impossible to turn. And then I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the street ahead of us, bathed in the eerie light of the street lamps. It wasn't a person, not fully. There was something wrong with it. Its body was unnaturally thin, elongated, like it didn't belong in this world. And its eyes, those eyes were dark, hollow voids that seemed to absorb all light. My breath caught in my throat as the car kept moving closer. I couldn't stop it. Theo, still sitting behind me, leaned forward. His face was no longer blank. There was a twisted smile spreading across his lips, his eyes now glowing faintly. "You see it, don't you?" he whispered. "This is where it ends." I screamed, but it was too late. The last thing I remember is the cold, empty gaze of that figure in front of me, and then darkness. I woke up hours later. The car was parked, the engine dead, the street eerily silent. Theo was gone. There was no trace of anything. I never drove Furtenberg again. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear the soft whisper of a message on my phone. I thought I knew the city. After all, I'd been driving for Uber for almost 3 years. I wasn't one of those drivers who just picked up anyone, hoping for a big tip. I had regulars people I got to know, sometimes only by voice, but still. I like to think I had a good understanding of people. Most passengers were quiet, polite, or just wanted to chat about the weather, music, or whatever random nonsense they were listening to on their phone. But one night, just a week ago, I picked up a ride I can't shake from my mind. It wasn't a long ride, barely 10 minutes, but it has stuck with me like a nightmare I can't wake up from. And it all started with a simple notification. The app pinged around 11:30 p.m. ride request, 12 minutes away. The street address was in a part of the city I wasn't familiar with, near some old buildings and alleyways. My first thought was that I'd have to navigate through tight streets, but no big deal. I drove all kinds of people around every corner of the city, from the nice parts to the rougher ones. When I pulled up to the address, I saw the person waiting on the curb. A man, late 20s, early 30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He looked like he had just come from some club, but the whole thing felt off. The streetlights cast long shadows across his face, making his features harder to see. I glanced at the app, checked his name Ryan, and then at the time. It was almost midnight now. "Hey, Ryan," I said as he climbed into the back seat. "Just take a left, then a right. You'll see the building on the left. Don't worry about the address. It's easier to find if you just follow my directions." Something about the way he said it, that urgency in his voice, gave me an odd feeling. It wasn't a long ride, sure, but the way he insisted on me following his directions so carefully rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe I was overthinking it, though. I had learned not to ask too many questions in this line of work. I started driving. The first few minutes were uneventful. The city's lights blurred past as I followed his instructions, taking lefts and rights at intersections I didn't recognize. But as we drove further, I started noticing something strange. There weren't many cars on the road anymore. The streets seemed deserted. Most of the windows on the buildings were dark, and the few that were lit had an almost sinister flicker to them. I turned to glance at Ryan through the rearview mirror, but he was staring out the window, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His posture was stiff, like he was bracing himself for something. I decided to break the silence. "So what's out here?" I asked casually, trying to make the ride feel less eerie. He didn't respond immediately. Then, when he did, it was with a strange low voice. "A place that doesn't belong. Not anymore." What did that even mean? It sounded like the kind of cryptic thing people say when they're trying to sound deep, but I couldn't get the chill off my spine. I focused on the road again. The longer I drove, the more it felt like the city had turned into a ghost town. Finally, he gave me another direction. "Turn left here." I did, pulling onto an old cracked road that led into what looked like a forgotten industrial district. The buildings here were crumbling, most of them boarded up, and the streetlights barely worked. "What's the address again?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He was quiet for a moment, then muttered, "Just up ahead, on the left." I glanced at my phone for reassurance, nothing but a blank screen. The map had frozen. I cursed under my breath. I knew my phone could be finicky, but this felt different. The eerie quiet of the area made me uneasy. The buildings, the dark streets, the lack of people, it all made me feel like I was driving into the middle of nowhere. As I approached an old, decaying warehouse, I saw a light flicker in the distance, barely visible through a crack in the boarded-up windows. It didn't feel right. I thought about asking Ryan again if he was sure this was the right place. But before I could, he spoke again. "You can stop here." I slammed the brakes. "What? Here?" Ryan's eyes met mine through the mirror. His gaze was intense, almost frantic, and I noticed something else. He wasn't looking at me, but through me. It was like I wasn't even in the car anymore. "Get out," he said. The chill in his voice froze me in place. I had always prided myself on staying calm, but this was different. Something about the look in his eyes, the way he was talking, made my blood run cold. I wasn't even sure if I was supposed to take him to the place he had asked for anymore. My gut screamed at me to leave, to drive away and forget this entire night, but something held me in place. "I'll wait for you here," Ryan added, his voice almost mechanical now. It was as though the person I had been talking to wasn't the same anymore. I didn't want to open my mouth. I didn't want to engage. No, I'm just going to drive off," I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice faltered. "You can get out." He didn't respond. His eyes never left mine. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. "Don't." My voice cracked. Ryan's fingers brushed against the handle, but instead of pulling it, he paused. He slowly turned his head toward the darkness outside. A thick silence settled between us. I noticed something that I hadn't before. There were no sounds. Not even the distant hum of a car or the rustling of trees. Just nothing. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. Then, in one swift motion, Ryan threw open the door and bolted out of the car. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched him disappear into the shadows. I sat there for a while, unable to move. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to wait. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard a faint tapping at my window. I froze, my eyes darting to the side. There was nothing outside. My hand trembled as I fumbled for my phone. The app was still frozen. I had no signal, no map, no direction. The tapping continued. I looked up, and there he was, Ryan, standing at the window, but this time, his face wasn't the same. His eyes were wide open, staring at me through the glass like he was trying to communicate something. I quickly started the car, my foot slamming on the gas pedal, and I sped away. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. When I finally reached a more populated area, I checked my phone again. The app had reset, and the ride was gone from my history. There was nothing but a blank screen. I haven't heard from Ryan since, but I can't forget his face, his voice, the way he looked at me like he wanted me to understand something. But I don't. I don't know what it was, but I don't want to know either. Sometimes when I drive late at night, I swear I hear tapping against the window. It's always the same, and I never, ever look.